That the Couta boat has made a truly remarkable comeback as a pleasure boat is one of the wonders of the maritime world. It had a slow beginning in the late 1970s, but quickly picked up pace.
Yeah, well, I think my earliest memory of a Couta boat was watching Walter Scott steam past our property down at Point King there. He used to come in, and this would be going back to the 60s when I first saw that, and he had an old boat called Princess. I've since learnt that it was a Jones boat, and we all remember watching Princess steaming in. She was painted bright red, so that's the first time I ever really was aware of a sailing fishing boat type down here, and I would have only been, probably 8 or 9 years old when I used to see her come past. Ted McKinnon's boat Murmurous is a boat that we always knew because Ted used to come and do work for us, looking after moorings, and he'd always look after people's boats, and Ted would steam around the point in Murmurous a lot. Didn't often see her under sail, but she was an unusual boat because she was so wide, 11'3" I think she is, but she's a full-on Couta boat type that Ken Lako built for Ted's father, and she was a boat we just loved as kids. You'd see Murmurous come around, and the closest she got, as kids, she was huge to us, and you just realise just how big she was and what an impressive boat she was. They're about my earliest memories.
I was familiar with the Couta boats here right from the 1950s when I was a kid messing about in the harbour here. And of course when I went fishing in 1961, we used to fish alongside the half dozen Couta boats that were left. Even then there was a few used to use sail still. Jack Arkle, of course, was a prominent one. He's a bloke who never moved with the times. He was fishing in the 1960s as he'd fished in the 1920s. He still owned his Couta, hauled his pots by hand. He had a domineering wife, and legend had it that she'd only allow him 2 gallons of petrol a week and 2 ounces of tobacco. When he ran out of petrol he had to sail. But he was a good Couta fisherman, a really good Couta fisherman. He'd always catch more than the others. He just had a natural ability. Maybe the fish followed the boat better, but when they stopped biting, when they went off the bite, he'd pull the sail up and he'd continue to catch Couta under sail while the others motored home. But I first became interested in Couta boats as recreational boats about 1969. A friend of mine, Bill Turner, had one, which had been the Jessie that Peter Locke had built for Harry Muchmore in 1939. And Bill used to use her weekends for whiting fishing, a bit of sailing. And I got enthused. And then in 72 or 73, when Jack Arkle retired, I ended up buying the Ariel and put her back to the original. We re-rigged her, built a centre case and centre plate for her, and used to sail her. We used to sail against the yachts here in the harbour. The old Ariel raised a few eyebrows too, the way she could move in light airs. She's a real classic of the 1920s. And went on from there and sort of got interested in researching the history of the boats then, and one thing's led to another.
My family were always interested in this type of, or the local boats that were really a derivative of the Couta boats. My father had one built in 1948 and another one built in 1956, and those were the boats that our family grew up on. In the middle 60s we bought an H28 and we sold our beautiful Vandra, and I went ocean racing for a few years. In 1970 I went around Australia after I'd left school and started work with Tri-Build, our construction company, and in the mid-70s I came back to down here and I bought a little boat called the Cutter. I think it was in about 1974, and I mucked around with that, and I can well remember my uncle Johnny Wilkins coming across, and he'd seen this book that Gary Kerr had written called Australian and New Zealand Sail Trainers, and it had all about the Couta boats and that type of boat, and I immediately fired up obviously an earlier life interest in these type of boats. And then I went down to see Gary at Portland, and we went out on the Ariel, We went for a sail across Portland Harbour and I was completely taken by the power and the size of the boat and the magnificent way it sailed. So I came back after that and I said, Alec, I want a Jones boat. And Alec said, oh no, you don't want a Jones boat, you know, they're the opposition, you know, the Laco boats are much better than the Jones boats. He said, go down and have a look at one my dad built called the Murmurus. And I hadn't realised at that time that the Murmurus was an actual Laco boat. So I went back to Alec and I said, oh, come on Alec, you know, I want to turn to the Century Couta boat, or perhaps a little bit a Rosebud type, perhaps a little bit like Murmurus. And at the time, Alec was about to start building a boat for my Uncle John, the Moonbird. And I was going to have a boat built after that. And it took a fair while building the Moonbird, and in between time, I bought a boat called the Helen at Coronella for, I think it was about $3,000. And she still had the Rugby car engine in it, as most of the Couta boats had, and I brought her home and I couldn't get the Rugby car engine was on its last legs, so I took the engine out and left it out, and I sailed her for a year or two without an engine. And when it got light, I sculled her back onto the moorings, and on a couple of occasions I've rowed her or pulled her in the Couta boat lingo from Sorrento back to Portsea, just to prove it could be done. The Helen was an absolute delight to sail. She was a lawn Couta boat, so she was a little bit shallow drafted, quite a beamy boat, and we had a great deal of fun in her.
I wasn't directly involved in the first races. I was still in Melbourne. I was training as an oarsman, and but I'd come down here on breaks, and I knew I'd met Tim Phillips at that stage, and he had, gosh, the first boat he had a little boat called the Couta, I think, which was a little clinker. I think it was a little lifeboat. Ted McKinnon's boat, of course, Murmurus, that I mentioned before, it used to go along. I went to a couple of the first races off the Mornington jetty, which was my Uncle Everett's property, and they used to run the races from there. There would have been half a dozen boats. Nick Holt had a boat, I think it was a Kaiser boat, Mr. Fish. Didn't have a centre plate in it, so it used to sail sideways. Tim later on got Helen together, which is a lovely little 20-foot clinker that Ken Laco built. Marcus Burke had a boat called Myrna Ruby that was there. I think she's about 22 feet, something like that. I can't really recall who the other boats were. There wasn't a group of Couta boats as such. They were a real odd mixture of different types of boats, basically gaff rigged. And that was probably their only similarity at that stage. And this is late 70s, 1977, 78.
At about that time I met Willie Baillieu and Dennis Wilkins, both of whom I'd known for a while, but they came to see me because I was interested in Couta boats, about getting a boat built. And I said, oh look, there's one bloke that you have to go and see, and that's Ken Laco. He knows all about Couta boats. So I took Willie down to see Ken Laco, and we had a talk about the best way to build a Couta boat, and subsequently Willie built the Hero down in Ken Laco's shed. Dennis bought the Rita in Kingston, and I purchased the Wattle.
I was curious enough, particularly after I saw Tim Phillips's boat Helen, the 20-footer, which was just a great looking little boat, clinker boat. Loved watching her sail, and Tim invited me out a couple of times. We went sailing, didn't have a motor. We sailed up the Queenscliff Creek against the tide, which was great fun, and that demonstrated to me that these boats were really good sailors. She was only 20 feet, and I thought, well, the 26-footers must be really quite an animal. I'd never really seen too many of them apart from Murmurus, but it led me to go down and seek out Ken Laco. So I met Ken, and I had this idea that maybe I could build a new boat.
When Will Bailey come to see me about building it, I said, oh yes, we could build you one. And I designed it out, and I fined her up a little bit over the years. When they went from petrol to diesel, we made them bigger aft so that they wouldn't pull the stern down when they were cootering. And I realised this, but I didn't know how much more we'd put into the stern to keep the stern from going down with the extra power. And when I built the Hero, I fined her up a little bit like the old boats, but not enough. And she was a little bit sluggish. But I designed her that way, and when Will come to us, we built her out of yew and pine, which was very good. We had a little bit of trouble with our ribs. We couldn't get the stuff we wanted, and we finished up with some silver ash from New South Wales, and that bent nicely, and we put that in. The yew and pine was good, decking was good. The boat, when we built her, we thought she was good, but she pulled a little bit hard on the tiller.
Willie had already decided he was going to build a new Couta boat down at Ken Lako's shed, and I said that so many of these boats had been bought by South Australian fishermen, and they'd found their way over there. Once they opened up the crayfishing, the southern crayfishing areas of South Australia, they had no boats to fish in, so they purchased all the old Couta boats. So we set off on a car trip. We started off in Adelaide, and within about half an hour of looking, we'd found the wattle. I spotted her with a pair of binoculars stern on, so she was very easy to see. We went down, and lo and behold, she had the for sale sign on her. So I bought the wattle in the first hour and a half of the trip. She had a 3-decker cabin on and had been traded in for a caravan. So she was sitting in the water almost derelict, but still had a 3-cylinder Lister diesel in it.
On the way back from that trip where we found Wattle, amazingly after just a couple of days we found her. On the way back we were in Kingston, and we were quite chuffed having found the boat, and we were then talking a lot more about Couta boats, and we were going a bit slower. Stopped at ports and we're talking to people and generally saying, do you know, are there any other of these Victorian Couta boats? Have you seen many around? There were quite a few sold up here, and we ran into all kinds of people, and people would say, yes, well, there was one, it was down here, but no, she got sold to someone in Tasmania, and we think, oh, well, that's the end of that one.
Eventually we found this absolute gem, the Rita, in Kingston, I think it was, and she'd been used as a chicken coop for the last 2 or 3 years, and also as a kids' playhouse previous to that. And Dennis Wilkins bought her.
It was during 1980 that we had these 3 projects going at the one time. Tim Phillips had Wattle out in a factory in Moorabbin, and he had Jack Norling helping him with the boat. Dennis Wilkins had Rita up in a shed in, I think it was down on the docks in South Melbourne somewhere, I can't remember exactly where now. And he had a fella called Charlie Strong helping him restore the boat. And I was living in a caravan on the front of Ken Lako's front lawn in Newhaven, working in Ken's shed, building a new boat, which was a whole new thing for me. I had no idea, I couldn't even nail 2 pieces of wood together before I started. But Ken was a pretty tough taskmaster. He'd do 12-hour days, no variation, and I was quite often left after he would finish at night to clean up. I was in there for another couple of hours, so I was doing 12, 14-hour days in that shed. I had no idea what was involved, and Ken was unbelievable. He could just take a huge piece of wood like the keel. You can't lift it. I mean, a 12x4 piece of yellow stringy bark is a very heavy piece of wood. Ken would move it around the shed using levers and chain blocks, and I'd go out down the street to get him something. When I'd come back, he'd have half the ribs checked out on one side, and he'd say, look, I've done all that. Now I've penciled all those ones in for you, now do the other ones, and then when you're done, come in and have some lunch. And he'd go off, and I'd look at it and think, by lunch? He's got to be kidding me. I'll be there for a week. Anyway, he pushed me along, and I'd get it done probably by the end of the day, and he'd be a bit down on me for being so slow. But I thought, well, I'm going all right. I'm going as hard as I can. But he was just a very, very hard, fast worker and accurate. He only had to look at something once and cut it, and it fit exactly. He just, the experience showed through. It was quite extraordinary to me. Very little measuring. He'd measure something once, the measurement was in his mind, he'd go and cut it, and it'd just fit beautifully. And he showed me how to do paint fits and all that stuff that you do when you're woodworking, and I learnt pretty fast because I listened to him. That experience, even at the time, and I was in my early 20s, was I early 20s, late 20s? even at the time, I realised it was an experience that I was probably never going to be able to repeat again, so I wanted to make the most of it. And I loved every minute of it down there with him, no matter how hard it was. And I learnt what it was like to work hard, which is what he'd done, and it was kind of a window for me on what it must have been like when he and his brothers worked together. But the thought of the four of them, Ken, Alec, Harold and George, all working together, all with that amount of knowledge and all with that amount of energy, was just, it's almost beyond comprehension, the work that they must have achieved. And as we know that they did achieve, it was extraordinary. Turning out a boat like Helen, the 20-footer that Tim Phillips owned at one stage, turning her out I think in 10 days from when they laid the keel to when they actually pushed her in the water with the paint still wet. I just couldn't conceive of anything like that, but that's the pace they worked at. And he had a couple of adzes in there, and watching him work with an adze and just the accuracy. And then he'd hand me the adze and say, finish that off, will you? Finish cleaning off the garboard rabbit, something like that. You know, I'd be terrified of making a mistake and chopping off part of the keel that wasn't supposed to come off. But I learnt, you know, pretty fast. I was careful, and he showed me how to hold it using my elbow in my stomach and just hold the handle short and take short sweeps with a bit of a follow through. But watching him use that adze was great. As he said, you've got to be able to cut a shaving from the keel that you could read a newspaper through. He said, when you can do that, you'll be handling the adze properly. When I completed Hero, which was a lot later than Ken Lako had wanted, but it was done, I think we did it just before Christmas in 1980. And I mean, Ken had imagined I'd be out of there in about 3 months, but it took from April through till Christmas to get the boat done. Getting the boat in the water was just an enormous change in what we'd been doing. We worked in that shed. It was hard, gruelling, dirty. Finally, I had this living boat in the water at the wharf at New Haven. Difficult conditions, as most people in that area know. The tide runs at about 5 or 6 knots past the wharf there, and wasn't a good place to hang up at night. I lived on board the boat while we finished off all the rigging, etc. I used to steam it right down to the bight every night with my girlfriend, and we'd anchor up and spend the night down there, have dinner on board, and then steam back in the morning, and we'd go back to the shed and make up the blocks. And we were doing all the running rigging and blocks and finishing off some spars and things like that. But when she was finally ready to go, there was a bit of a southwesterly blowing. We waited for that for a couple of days and got some mates around. I think Peter Burke, Tim Phillips, Clive Beckingsale, a few others came around, and we sailed Hero around to Port Phillip. The first race, 1980, Ken Lako came and sailed with me actually in the very first race, which was nice.
Throughout the year of 1980, Willie built the Hero down at Ken Lako's shed. I restored the wattle at Brayside, and Dennis Wilkins restored the Rita at Port Melbourne. And in the year 1980-81 season, we all raced them down at Portsea, and gee, didn't it create something? People used to follow us around saying, where do we purchase these boats and how do we do it? And it was just so much interest around it. It was absolutely breathtaking. So the summer of 80-81, we were all out there racing our boats and sailing and having a great time. And everyone came up to us to say, well, how do we get into this? Where do we get one of these boats? You couldn't go sailing without having 2 or 3 boats following you around behind asking questions. And the next year I bought a boat called the Royal in Mordialloc Creek and had a tumultuous sail from Mordialloc down to Sorrento. She was pretty old and rotten, the Royal, and she had a Jubilee rig on her, and it took about 2 hours to cut the chains off her because she hadn't been out of the creek for many years. We got back to Sorrento, had to pull the boat out straight away because it was leaking like a sieve, and what we found when we pulled her out was the most beautiful Michi Lako turn of the century type Couta boat, built in 1924, the Royal was, named after the royal visit of that year. And we pulled her up to my house in Dalgany Avenue, and I didn't go back to work. I just started work on the Royal, restoring the Royal that year. That was in the year of 1981. and I put her in the water at the end of that year, and so therefore we had another boat. At that stage I'd never built a new boat, but I'd done a couple of years of solid work on restoring boats. So I phoned up Ken Loco and I said, Ken, how about designing me a boat, and would you do the same as what you did with Will? Could I go down and build the boat in your shed? And he said, oh, Tim, that would be fine. He designed me a beautiful boat which subsequently was named Sally after my girlfriend and now my wife, and I bought the keel and took it down to Ken's, and let me tell you about the story of the first day working with Ken Loco. Before I knew what was happening, Ken had marked the centre line on the keel and had marked out both sides and was chopping into it with a electric power saw. Before the day was completed, the keel was completely finished with the rabbet for the centre plate case in it, and while I was doing that, Ken cut out the stern post and handed it to me after lunch. He said, "I'll put this on here, son, can you, just like this?" And I said, "Oh, okay." And by the end of the day, the keel, stem and stern posts were set up and bolted on, and all the knees were done. So I come back for work the next day, a little bit stiff and sore, and Ken's down on the floor lofting out the plans, and I made the moulds on the second day, which was quite an easy job under Ken's instruction. And by the time the week was out, the boat was ready to set up. When I mean set up, that's to bend the keel down and to put the moulds into position. It was just working with Ken Loco was like working with a whirlwind. Ken didn't walk around the shed, he ran around the shed, and he was always thinking 3 or 4 steps in advance. He was great to work for, or great to work with, I should say. He taught me everything.
Tim had sold Helen to Peter Burke, and Peter and Jane were sailing that beautiful little boat. The Parkinson boys, the fishermen from Blairgowrie, had put Swan back in the water, the old family boat, and rigged it up, put the centreboard in her and had a rig. There may have been 1 or 2 other boats joined in, but suddenly there was much more competition. It was very exciting because no one had seen 3 full-blooded 26-foot Couta boats sailing alongside each other for I don't know how many years, probably since pre-Second World War, I would think. And we had the 3 of them, Rita, Wattle and Hero, out racing in all the races. There were only about 4 or 5 races a year at that stage. So we started to organise more races. There was more interest. We had a good race in Port Melbourne, which became an annual event, and we used to sail the boats up and usually keep them in Williamstown while we're up there for a few days, have the race. There were lots of other boats joined in that weren't Couta boats, but that didn't matter. We had an interesting collection of boats. And of course, the interest in Hero as a new boat was that people thought, well, you know, Will's built a new boat, maybe I'll build a new boat. Clive Beckingsale, who used to sail with me on Hero, he started to kind of take over a bit. I'd be sailing and he'd be telling me what to do, and I kind of, you know, I thought, well, I won't react to it, but Clive gets a bit bossy. And in the end, I think we kind of agreed. We said, it would be a good idea, Clive, maybe if you built your own boat, because then you could do whatever you wanted to do. So it was all done in, you know, in good spirit. But Clive announced to me that he thought, yes, that would be a good idea. He'd like to build a boat, and would I give him a hand? And I said, no problem, love to. So we got another design from Ken, and we set up in the back of Clive's partner's house in Sorrento, built a temporary shed and set up to build Victory there in 1982. There was another group of people came in after that, another wave. Peter Graham, who built Minerva. He had Minerva built for him by Chris Young. Got Ken to do the design for him. Bill Davis had Ken do him a design for Kate, and at the same time I was working with Ken on a design for a new boat. I decided that Hero was still more of the motoring type of boat that these Couta boats had evolved into, with quite large sections down aft, and was more interested in the older type of Couta boat. By then I'd had a look at Muriel on the slip down at Flinders when Andy Johansson still had her, and I could see the difference in the stern quarters on the boat. They were much finer, obviously meant to sail.
Hero was good. but she pulled a little bit hard on the tiller, and Will didn't like her. So after he came back from sailing on the America Tour, which won the Australia Tour, which won the America Cup, he wanted to design another one. So he designed the Ajax. He brought it over to me, and I just he bought the design. He drew it up himself, similar to the Hero, only improvements he sought. And so he brought it over to me, and I altered her a little bit, not much. And he built her, and she was very good. And she was more balanced. So afters, we fined them up a little bit on the after, from the case aft, and got them back to their better trim. But the design actually went back instead of going forward, because when the later boats we built for cootering were bigger aft with the diesel motors, and they were big. In the early days when the first diesels come, they were big, and later on they got the high speed ones which are smaller.
I was working with Ken on a new design for a new boat which I built in 1984 in Sorrento, Ajax, and built her alongside Kate that Tim Phillips was building in Tim's first shed. I helped Tim with that shed. I put all the flooring down, I dug all the footings for his factory. I did quite a lot of physical work on the building of that shed. And then set up in there to build Ajax. Tim built Kate alongside, so we had another kind of Couta boat race, I suppose, as it turned out. This was the land racing, and from the laying of the keel to the launching of the boats, you know, Tim and I were working 12, 14-hour days. We got both those boats done. And by now the Couta boat fleet's really starting to develop, because there were other people restoring boats too. They found old boats, and they were being restored, and there were boats turning up from everywhere. And I suppose we're up to a dozen or 15 pretty decent boats, plus the fairly motley fleet of boats that didn't quite fit the mould, the Mr. Fishers and boats like that didn't have centre plates in them. And so it's quite a decent collection of boats. But the new boats coming on really kind of broke through. We worked out how to build the sails again, and it really was trial and error, because no one had built gaff sails of that size for a long time. Col Anderson from Hood Sails was very good. He used to laugh just saying they'd just blown up cadet dinghies, because they were the same sort of sails, and he'd cut those when he was smaller. So basically that was it. It was a larger version of a cadet dinghy sail, a peaky gunter, I think we used to call it. And the more boats that came along, the more opportunities there were to improve things like the sails, and they really started to get pretty good. Peter Graham was a highly competitive sailor, and I think he saw our fleet as a bit of a joke, but he loved the boats, and he got hold of Minerva, and when he rigged that boat, we didn't catch him for about 18 months, I wouldn't think. It was probably the first time anyone was able to beat him in a race. He won everything. And the boat wasn't that different to Victory, but he had her rigged beautifully. She was well sailed, and he was the first one to seriously show the potential of these boats for how fast they could be raced, and everyone had to lift their standards, and we did. And there were new boats being built. I had Ajax on the water. She turned out to be a nice fast boat, and she went well from the beginning. Goodness me, Tim was starting to build boats for other people, and other people like George Kimpton and Dick Whittaker started building boats in Tim's shed under his direction, and those boats were put on the water. Jane Louise and I can't remember the name of Dick's boat, Krista it was, she's a lovely boat. And there's just a stream of boats coming in, and more people getting excited about them. And it was moving so quickly, it was hard to kind of, I'm trying to remember the feeling at the time, but it was very exciting. But it was only a summertime thing. We had about, 10 or 12 races a year. The annual race at Portsea, the fishing boat race, was always big and popular. Everyone used to come down to see the Couta boats tie up on the jetty, and it's now got so big that, we can't put all the Couta boats on the jetty these days. They're anchored out there, they're all over the place. There'll be 40 or 50 boats tied up at the jetty and another 20 floating around. It's huge, but the feeling at the time just happened so quickly. It all happened over a period of about 5 years, from when the first serious boats went on the water till everybody wanted one, and it was just an explosion of Couta boats, and it's continued till today. There's just more and more boats being built. Parallel to having these boats in the water, of course, comes the other side, which was the social side. And we were finding that as we have these races, we generally have something on afterwards. There was always a beer to be had and stories to be told, and that's how a lot of people learnt, because they brought friends along to these gatherings. We'd be at a barbecue somewhere after a race, might be Queenscliff or Williamstown, Port Melbourne. People came along and they'd not only sail on the boats and have a great day, they'd learn a bit about what was going on, and then they'd get involved in the discussion about, oh, there's a boat down in such and such which the bloke wants to sell, you know, someone ought to buy that because it's a good boat, it's a Michilako boat. So inevitably that'd get bought as well. We had some great social events that became, you know, legendary. I mean, the Parkinsons, Des Parkinsons and his sons in Blairgowrie put on a fish barbecue after that last race. So, I mean, that was legendary. They were fishermen, and of course we just had this great barbecue, and people used to love going along to that. And we used to have, after the fishing boat regatta in Portsea every January, put on a big party in Tim Phillips's boatyard, and that went on for years until we found the numbers were, I mean, we were getting 500 people coming along to these things. It was enormous. So that had to be changed, and they eventually turned that into a picnic, which was held the following day at quarantine. But I mean, those things, it became an enormous focus socially down here as well. And some negative comment about it every now and again these days. They think that, you know, the Couta Boat is the floating tennis court. But the comment only comes from people that don't have a Couta Boat. Those that sail them know that there's a lot involved, there's a lot of work, dedication and skill, and you've got to be safety conscious. It's not just a social event on the water, but it did promote a great linking together of all kinds of people down here, which has been quite an interesting phenomenon because of the speed that it happened. It took people like Peter Graham, who, as I said, gave us an absolute flogging in the racing and just left us for dead, because he really was a racing sailor, for us to realise that at some stage we would have to be very careful that the quest for speed when you're racing the boats didn't kind of lead away from the type, from the origins of the type of boat, and people would try and cut down the displacement or make them narrower or put more sail on. And it didn't take long before we realised that we would need to get together and make some sort of an association to try and preserve the type of boat. And I think Peter Graham himself was one of the leading hands in that. He realised that there was enough boats out there that we needed to try and restrict any development that might happen of the type. So we had a fundamental set of rules that we worked on drawing up, and I think Barry Scott from the Victorian Yachting Council came down and wanted to help. He was interested in the boats. He had a house down here, and he offered to help draw up a constitution, and we had a series of meetings, the aim of which was to form a club which could then be affiliated with the VYC, which was very non-Couta boat, non-fishing boat, but was necessary in order to preserve the boats. And it's been successful in doing that, because we've had a set of guidelines which has now become a pretty fixed set of rules about design, and I've just completed another boat for a fellow in Western Australia who's wants to put it into survey, and there's all kinds of things he wanted to do to the boat, and I said, well, this is the guidelines. If you want to race in the fleet and have a registration with the club, this is what you'll need to do. And I was able to just get it off the computer and email it through to him. Very modern, very non-fishing boat also, but that's the way things are now. It's been tied together nicely, and we've now got a fleet of boats that are built in exactly the same way that they used to be built. There's very little difference in design or displacement. There's variations above the water, so they all look a bit different, but the type is well preserved now.